my son Daniel, the boy I once cradled through fevers and fretful nights, the young man whose college tuition I'd paid by scrubbing other people's floors until my own hands were raw and aching, told me I shouldn't be so sensitive. Sensitive, that was his word, delivered with a sigh of weary impatience. After his wife, my daughter-in-law, Amelia, a woman whose hands had never known a day of honest labor beyond selecting the right shade of beige for their minimalist living room, had looked me dead in the eye, in my own kitchen, and called me the maid. Not to my face, of course. She wasn't quite that brave. Or perhaps, just not that foolish. No, she'd said it to Daniel. A stage whisper loud enough for me to hear as I cleared away the remnants of the Sunday dinner I'd spent all day preparing, a dinner she'd barely touched, complaining that my roast chicken was a tad dry and my gravy a bit too traditional. "Honestly, Daniel?" she'd murmured, her voice dripping with a condescension that felt like acid on my skin. "Your mother is a treasure, always tidying up. It's like having a live-in maid, isn't it?" And Daniel, my Daniel, had merely chuckled, a weak, placating sound. "She likes to keep busy, Ames," he'd replied, patting her arm. Later, when I'd confronted him, my voice trembling with a hurt so profound it felt like a physical blow, he'd waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Mom, don't be so sensitive. Amelia didn't mean anything by it. It's just her way. You know how she is, a bit blunt." Blunt, these were the words they used to gaslight me, to diminish my pain, to excuse their casual soul-crushing cruelty. They thought my silence, my pained nods, my retreat into the quiet corners of their increasingly uncomfortable home was acceptance. They thought the old woman, who still darned Daniel's socks and baked his favorite apple pie from scratch, was too tired, too beaten down, to do anything but endure. They forgot that even the most patient river can eventually, with enough provocation, carve a new, unexpected, and utterly devastating path. They were about to learn that sensitivity, when pushed too far, can forge itself into a will of tempered steel, and that a mother's love, when betrayed so profoundly, can find expression not in forgiveness, but in a meticulously planned, legally sound, and utterly irrevocable form of justice. They called me a maid. I was about to show them who truly owned the estate. Now let me tell you what really happened. The arrival of Amelia into Daniel's life, and by extension mine, had been a subtle but persistent shift in the emotional landscape of our family. Daniel had always been a good boy, perhaps a little too eager to please, a little too easily swayed, but fundamentally kind. His father, my dear Robert, had passed away when Daniel was just starting university, and the two of us had clung to each other, navigating our shared grief, forging a bond I thought was unbreakable. I'd worked tirelessly, taking on extra cleaning jobs, mending clothes for neighbors, anything to ensure Daniel could finish his degree without the burden of debt. He'd been grateful then, his hugs a little tighter, his "I love you, moms" a little more frequent. Amelia was different. She came from a family of some means, her aspirations clearly aimed far higher than Daniel's modest upbringing. She was beautiful, in a brittle, polished way, her ambition a palpable force. From the beginning, I felt like an outsider in her presence, a slightly embarrassing relic from a past Daniel was being encouraged, subtly at first, then more overtly, to shed. Their wedding was a grand affair, far beyond what I could have contributed to, funded largely by Amelia's parents. I'd worn my best dress, a simple navy silk I'd made myself, and felt acutely aware of the designer labels accruing me. Amelia's mother, a woman whose smile never quite reached her cold, appraising eyes, had treated me with a polite, condescending distance that set the tone for my future interactions with my daughter-in-law. After they married, Daniel and Amelia moved into a trendy new condo downtown. My visits, initially frequent, became less so. Amelia was always terribly busy, their weekends completely booked. When I did see them, usually for a strained Sunday dinner at their place, they rarely came to my small, comfortable bungalow, Amelia having once commented that it smelled faintly of lavender and old memories, a remark I didn't take as a compliment. I often felt like an interloper, a necessary but slightly inconvenient family obligation. Amelia's criticisms were rarely direct, more often delivered as helpful suggestions or observations about how modern people did things. My cooking was charming, but a little heavy. My home was cozy but perhaps a bit cluttered. My stories about Daniel's childhood were met with a polite, fixed smile that didn't quite mask her impatience to move on to more interesting topics, usually involving her latest social conquests or a planned luxury vacation. Daniel, caught in the middle, would offer weak defenses, or more often, just remain silent, his discomfort a palpable presence in the room. The maid comment wasn't the first, Barb, not by a long shot, but it was perhaps the most blatant, the most dismissive. It stripped away any pretense of respect, reducing me to a mere functionary in their lives, my love and labor taken not just for granted, but actively devalued. And Daniel's casual dismissal of my hurt, his prioritizing of Amelia's bluntness over his own mother's pain, was a betrayal that cut deeper than any of Amelia's carefully veiled insults. That night, after they'd left, leaving me with a sink full of their dirty dishes and a heart full of ashes, I sat alone in my quiet kitchen, the scent of Amelia's expensive perfume still lingering faintly in the air, and I made a decision. My sensitivity, as Daniel had so carelessly labeled it, was not a weakness. It was the wellspring of my empathy, my compassion, my capacity for love. And if that love was no longer valued, no longer reciprocated, then perhaps it was time to redirect it, to invest it where it might be appreciated, where it might do some good. My will, drafted years ago, leaving everything to Daniel, my only child, suddenly felt like a testament not to my love, but to my own foolish, unseeing naivety. That, I decided, would have to change. And Amelia, with her casual cruelty, had just handed me the pen. The week following the Maid incident was a study in cold, quiet fury on my part. I went about my days, tending my small garden, reading my books, but beneath the surface of my carefully maintained composure, a new resolve was hardening. Daniel called once, a brief perfunctory check-in, his tone suggesting he considered the matter closed, my sensitivity presumably having abated. He didn't mention Amelia's comment, nor did he apologize for his own dismissive reaction. It was clear they both expected me to simply absorb the insult, to swallow my hurt, as I had so many times before, but something had shifted within me. The casual cruelty of Amelia's words, compounded by Daniel's complicity, had been a breaking point. It wasn't just about being called a maid, it was about the years of subtle belittlement, the constant feeling of being an outsider in my own son's life, the slow, painful erosion of my worth in their eyes. I thought of Robert, my dear husband. He would have been appalled. He had always treated me with such love, such respect. He would never have stood by and allowed anyone, not even his own son, to diminish me so. The memory of his steadfast decency, his unwavering support, fueled my determination. I would not let his legacy, the home we had built together, the small savings we had painstakingly accumulated, be a reward for such profound disrespect. My first call was to Eleanor Vance, a retired solicitor and an old friend of Robert's, a woman whose sharp mind and even sharper tongue were legendary. We hadn't spoken in ages, but I knew if anyone could offer sound, unsentimental advice, it was Eleanor. "Eleanor," I began, after we'd exchanged the usual pleasantries. "It's Martha. Martha Brewster. Robert's Martha." "Martha, dear," her voice, though aged, still crackled with energy. "How lovely to hear from you. It's been too long. Is everything all right?" "Not entirely, Eleanor," I said, and then the whole sorry tale poured out. Amelia's condescension, Daniel's weakness, the maid comment, my growing sense of disillusionment. Eleanor listened in silence, her only interjections an occasional, the unmitigated nerve, or a sympathetic, "Oh, Martha." When I finished, there was a thoughtful pause. "Then, well, Martha," she said, her voice brisk, "it sounds to me like your Daniel has married a thoroughly unpleasant piece of work, and in doing so, has rather lost his own moral compass. And you, my dear, have been far too patient for far too long." Her blunt assessment, so devoid of platitudes, was strangely comforting. "What are you thinking of doing?" she asked. "I'm thinking of changing my will, Eleanor," I said, my voice surprisingly firm. "Substantially." "Good for you," Eleanor declared. "It's your money, your property, your legacy. You have every right to decide where it goes, and frankly, from what you've told me, leaving it to that pair would be tantamount to rewarding bad behavior on an epic scale." We talked for over an hour. Eleanor, though officially retired, still possessed a keen legal mind. She advised me on the steps I would need to take. The importance of ensuring the new will was watertight, irrefutable. She recommended a younger solicitor in her old firm, a Miss Albright, whom she described as bright as a button and tenacious as a terrier. Before we hung up, Eleanor said, "Martha, one more thing. Don't tell them, not a word. Let them continue in their blissful, arrogant ignorance. The surprise, my dear, will be all the sweeter." Her advice resonated with a part of me I hadn't realized was so vengeful. No, not vengeful. It was about justice. It was about ensuring that the final chapter of my life, the legacy I left behind, reflected my true values, not the distorted reflection Amelia and Daniel seemed to see. The following week, I made an appointment with Miss Albright. She was, as Eleanor had promised, sharp, efficient, and deeply empathetic. I laid out my wishes clearly: my small bungalow, the repository of so many precious memories of Robert, and a happier Daniel. I wanted it sold, the proceeds to be divided. A portion, a significant one, would go to the local hospice where Robert had spent his final, peaceful days, cared for with such compassion. Another portion to an animal shelter I'd always supported, a cause Robert and I both held dear, and a smaller but still meaningful bequest to my niece Clara, Robert's sister's girl, a sweet, struggling single mother who had always shown me kindness and respect, qualities seemingly so lacking in my own son's household. Daniel, Amelia, they would receive a token sum, $1 each, enough to ensure they couldn't legally contest the will on the grounds of having been forgotten, but a clear, unambiguous statement of their disinheritance. Ms. Albright raised an eyebrow at the $1 bequest. "A classic, Martha," she said, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "Makes a very definite point. Signing the new will, with Ms. Albright and her impassive paralegal as witnesses, felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating cloak. It was an act of profound liberation." I walked out of her office, into the bright afternoon sunshine, feeling lighter, stronger than I had in years. The maid had just taken control of the entire estate, and her former employers were none the wiser. The irony was not lost on me, and it brought a grim, satisfying smile to my lips. Life after changing the will continued on its familiar, quiet trajectory, at least on the surface. Daniel and Amelia remained blissfully, arrogantly, unaware of the seismic shift that had occurred in my estate planning. Their visits, when they happened, were still infrequent, still tinged with that familiar blend of condescension and entitlement. Amelia would flit about my small living room, her eyes scanning my modest possessions with a barely concealed disdain, occasionally offering unsolicited advice on how I might modernize or declutter. Daniel would make awkward small talk, his gaze often drifting towards the television, his mind clearly elsewhere. I played my part, the quiet, unassuming mother, nodding politely, offering them tea and biscuits, betraying nothing of the profound changes I had set in motion. It was a strange, almost surreal experience, observing them, knowing what I knew. Their casual assumptions about their future inheritance, the way they spoke of "when mom's not around anymore," with a disturbing lack of sentimentality, now struck me not with pain, but with a kind of detached, almost clinical amusement. They were like actors in a play, delivering their lines with conviction, utterly oblivious to the fact that the script had been rewritten, the ending dramatically altered. My internal monologue during these encounters was a rich tapestry of irony and a growing sense of quiet power. When Amelia once commented, with a sigh, "This little house must be worth a bit now, Mom, with property prices the way they are. It'll be a nice little nest egg for Daniel one day," I merely smiled and said, "One never knows what the future holds, dear." The maid comment, though it still stung, had become a strange sort. It was a reminder of their arrogance, yes, but also of my own strength, my own agency. They had tried to diminish me, to reduce me to a caricature of a doddering, subservient old woman. They had failed, miserably. I found a quiet satisfaction in the small, everyday acts of tending to my home, my garden, my own well-being. Each rose I pruned, each batch of cookies I baked for myself, or for Clara, or for the kind nurses at the hospice, felt like a small act of defiance, a reclaiming of my own worth. My interactions with Clara, my niece, became more frequent. She'd call for a chat, or drop by with her two boisterous, lovable children, who filled my quiet bungalow with a joyous, chaotic energy I hadn't realized how much I'd missed. Clara never asked for anything, never hinted at my financial situation. Her affection was genuine, her respect for me palpable. She was, in many ways, the daughter Amelia had never been, the family I had yearned for. These visits were a balm to my soul, a reminder that true familial connection was not about obligation or expectation, but about genuine love, mutual respect, and shared laughter. One afternoon, Daniel called, his voice unusually strained. "Mom," he said, "Amelia and I are thinking of doing some major renovations on our place, knocking through a wall, new kitchen, the works. It's going to be expensive." I waited, my heart a steady, even beat. Here it comes, I thought, the inevitable prelude to a request for a loan. "We were wondering," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial wheedle, "if maybe you'd consider helping us out a bit. As an advance on, an advance on his inheritance." The sheer, unadulterated nerve of it, even now, almost took my breath away. "Daniel," I said, my voice calm, measured, "my financial situation is quite carefully managed these days. I'm afraid I'm not in a position to offer that kind of assistance." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Not in a position," he finally spluttered. "But, Mom, it's us, your family. Surely," I interrupted, my voice like ice, "you wouldn't expect me to jeopardize my own security for your non-essential home renovations, Daniel, especially given recent events." The unspoken Maid comment hung heavy in the air between us. He backtracked quickly, his tone shifting from wheedling to wounded. I just thought you'd want to help, to be a part of our lives, our future." "I have always wanted to be a part of your life, Daniel," I said, a genuine sadness in my voice now. "But a part of it that is valued, respected. Not just a financial resource to be tapped when convenient." He mumbled something about me being overly sensitive again, and ended the call abruptly. I hung up the phone, a small, grim smile playing on my lips. The maid was no longer taking orders. She was, in fact, beginning to rather enjoy her newfound, if secret, power. The knowledge of my revised will was a silent shield, protecting me from their manipulations, their casual cruelty. They could scheme and wheedle all they liked. They were playing a game whose rules they no longer understood, for a prize that was no longer theirs to claim. The months leading up to what would be my final Christmas were a quiet unfolding of this new dynamic. Daniel and Amelia's attempts to extract financial assistance continued, albeit with a growing desperation and a decreasing subtlety that was almost pitiable, had they not been so thoroughly unpleasant. Amelia, in a particularly audacious move, casually left a glossy brochure for a luxury Caribbean cruise on my coffee table during one of her brief perfunctory visits. "Wouldn't that be lovely, Martha?" she'd sighed, her eyes gleaming with an acquisitive light. "A real treat for you, and of course we'd be happy to accompany you. Make sure you are well looked after." The implication was clear. I would pay, they would play. I'd merely smiled and said the sea air didn't agree with my rheumatism. The disappointment on her face was almost comical. Daniel, meanwhile, tried a different tack, appealing to my maternal guilt. He'd call with a litany of woes: unexpected car repairs, a looming tax bill, the crippling cost of organic quinoa for Amelia's latest health kick. Each tale of financial hardship was followed by a pointed silence, an unspoken expectation that I would rush in with my checkbook, as I had so many times in the past. I listened politely, offered sympathetic murmurs, and then changed the subject. His frustration was palpable, a simmering resentment that radiated through the phone lines. Their charade of filial concern was wearing thin, their true motives laid bare by their increasingly blatant attempts to access my perceived wealth. It was a sad, unedifying spectacle, and I found myself feeling not anger, but a kind of weary pity for them. They were so blinded by their own greed, so trapped in their materialistic aspirations, that they were incapable of seeing the true poverty of their own spirits. My interactions with Clara and her children, in stark contrast, were a source of genuine joy. They visited regularly, filling my small bungalow with laughter and warmth. The children, Leo and Mia, were delightful, their innocent affection a balm to my soul. Clara never once mentioned my finances, never asked for anything beyond my companionship, my stories, the occasional batch of my famous ginger snaps. She'd help me in the garden, her hands as gentle with the roses as they were with her children. We'd sit at my kitchen table sipping tea, talking for hours, a comfortable, easy camaraderie between us that I had never shared with Amelia. It was a reminder of what family could be, what it should be, a haven of love, support, and mutual respect, not a battleground of entitlement and manipulation. As Christmas approached, I knew this would likely be my last. My health, though stable, was undeniably declining. The old aches were more persistent, the fatigue more profound. There was a quiet acceptance within me, a readiness for whatever lay ahead. I made my preparations, as I always did. I baked my fruitcake, rich with brandy and memories of Christmases past with Robert. I decorated my small tree with the familiar, cherished ornaments, each one holding a story. I wrapped the few small gifts I had chosen for Clara and her children, simple, thoughtful tokens of my affection. Daniel and Amelia, predictably, invited themselves for Christmas dinner. "We wouldn't want you to be alone, Mom," Daniel had said, his voice oozing a false solicitude that made my skin crawl. I knew their motives. It was one last desperate attempt to ingratiate themselves, to position themselves favorably before the inevitable reading of the will they still assumed would be in their favor. I agreed, of course. It would be, I suspected, a final, illuminating performance. The dinner itself was a strained, uncomfortable affair. Amelia, dressed in a new, ridiculously expensive cashmere sweater, a little pre-Christmas treat for myself, she'd trilled, her eyes flicking towards me as if expecting me to offer to pay for it, chattered incessantly about her holiday plans, a skiing trip to Aspen, apparently, for which they were still finalizing the funding. Daniel, morose and sullen, picked at his food, occasionally interjecting with a heavy sigh or a pointed comment about the financial pressures of the season. I listened, offered polite, non-committal responses, and observed them with a kind of detached, anthropological interest. They were so utterly, blindly consumed by their own greed, so completely oblivious to the true meaning of family, of love, of Christmas. After the meal, as I was serving my fruitcake, which Amelia naturally declined, citing her gluten intolerance, a condition that seemed to conveniently manifest only when faced with my home baking, Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," he began, his voice taking on that familiar wheedling tone, "about our little cash flow situation. Amelia and I were wondering." I held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Daniel," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "Christmas is a time for peace, for goodwill. Let us not mar it with discussions of a financial nature. Those matters, I assure you, have all been taken care of, in a manner I deem most appropriate." Their faces fell. The air in the room crackled with unspoken resentment. The rest of the evening passed in a strained, uncomfortable silence. They left early, their perfunctory "Merry Christmas, Moms" ringing hollow in the suddenly peaceful room. As I cleared away the remnants of the meal, I felt not sadness, but a profound sense of relief. It was over. The charade, the manipulation, the constant wearying battle of wills. I had stood my ground, I had protected my legacy, and I had done so with a quiet dignity they could never comprehend. My true Christmas gift, I realized, was not the expensive, unwanted cashmere sweater Amelia had so ostentatiously worn, but the unshakable peace that now settled in my heart. My passing, a few months later, was as quiet and unremarkable as the life I had come to embrace in my final years. I slipped away peacefully in my sleep, in my own bed, in my own small sunlit bungalow, the scent of spring roses from Clara's latest bouquet perfuming the air. Robert, I imagined, was waiting for me, his smile as warm and loving as I remembered. The reading of the will, as orchestrated by the ever-efficient Miss Albright, took place a week later in her discreet downtown office. Daniel and Amelia, I was later told by Clara, who, as a minor beneficiary, had also been invited, arrived looking a picture of somber, if somewhat impatient, grief. Amelia was dressed head to toe in new, expensive-looking black. A theatrical widow's veil perched artfully on her perfectly coiffed hair. Daniel, his face a mask of carefully constructed sorrow, clutched a handkerchief. Ms. Albright, Clara recounted, began by reading the usual legal preamble, her voice calm, measured, betraying nothing of the bombshell she was about to deliver. Then she moved to the operative clauses, the distribution of my modest estate. "To my beloved niece, Clara Elizabeth Mason," Ms. Albright read, "in gratitude for her years of unwavering kindness, affection, and respect, I bequeath the sum of $20,000 and my collection of antique rose-patterned china." Clara told me, she gasped, her eyes filling with tears, not just for the unexpected generosity, but for the acknowledgement, the love that lay behind it. Daniel and Amelia exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance. 20,000? A respectable sum, perhaps, but surely just a prelude to the main event, the bequeathing of the house, the bulk of the estate, to Daniel, the only son, the rightful heir. Ms. Albright continued, "To the Robert Brewster Memorial Hospice, in recognition of the compassionate care provided to my late husband, and in support of their invaluable work in the community, I bequeath the sum of $50,000. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Amelia's perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together in a faint frown. This was not going according to their script. To the Paws and Claws Animal Shelter, Ms. Albright read on. In memory of my lifelong love for all creatures great and small, and in appreciation for the joy they bring to so many, I bequeath the sum of $50,000. Amelia, Clara said, let out a small involuntary gasp. The animal shelter? Ahead of her own son? The air in the room was growing thick with a palpable tension. And then the final devastating blow. As to the remainder of my estate, Miss Albright read, her voice clear, unwavering, including my property located at 12 Willow Creek Lane, and all residual funds, savings, and investments, after all debts and taxes have been settled, I have made the following provision. Daniel leaned forward, his expression a mixture of anticipation and a dawning sickening dread. Amelia held her breath. To my son, Daniel Robert Brewster, Ms. Albright intoned, I bequeath the sum of $1. A choked sound escaped Daniel's lips. Amelia's face went white. And to my daughter-in-law, Amelia Constance Brewster, née Harrington, Ms. Albright concluded, her gaze sweeping briefly, impassively, over their stunned faces. I also bequeath the sum of $1, in recognition of services rendered, the nature of which she will undoubtedly understand. The silence in the room, Clara said, was absolute, broken only by Amelia's sharp, incredulous intake of breath. Daniel just stared, his face ashen, his mouth agape. The maid had spoken, and her words, delivered from beyond the grave, were a judgment more damning, more irrevocable, than any courtroom verdict. Ms. Albright, ever the professional, calmly gathered her papers. That concludes the reading of the will of Martha Eleanor Brewster, she announced. A copy will be provided to all beneficiaries. If there are any questions. But Daniel and Amelia, Clara told me, were already stumbling out of the office, their faces a mask of disbelief, fury, and a dawning, horrified understanding of the magnitude of their miscalculation. They had played a long, cynical game, predicated on my perceived weakness, my maternal obligation, my supposed senility. They had sought to exploit my love, to manipulate my affections, to secure for themselves a comfortable future built on the foundations of my life's work, and they had lost. Spectacularly. My legacy, I hoped, would be more than just the financial bequests to the causes I held dear. It would be a testament to the quiet strength of an ordinary woman who had refused to be diminished, who had found her voice however late in the day, and who had, in her own small way, ensured that justice, in its most poetic and satisfying form, had finally been served. The maid had not just tidied up, she had, with a final decisive sweep, cleared the entire damn house. The aftermath of the will reading, as relayed to me by a still somewhat stunned Clara, was as predictable as it was, in a grimly satisfying way, inevitable. Daniel and Amelia, faced with the undeniable, legally binding reality of their disinheritance, apparently descended into a vortex of bitter recriminations and impotent rage. Their dreams of a life funded by Mom's little nest egg had evaporated, leaving behind only the ashes of their own greed and the stark, uncomfortable truth of their own characters. Clara told me that Amelia, according to mutual acquaintances, small towns, after all, are notorious for their efficient gossip mills, had become almost unhinged, railing against my senile cruelty, Miss Albright's manipulative interference, and Daniel's pathetic weakness in failing to secure their anticipated fortune. Her carefully constructed facade of sophisticated composure had shattered, revealing the grasping, entitled woman beneath. Their major renovations, so confidently discussed in my presence, were now, presumably, on indefinite hold. The luxury Caribbean cruise would remain firmly in the glossy pages of the brochure. Daniel, Clara heard, had become withdrawn, morose, the public humiliation of being bequeathed a single dollar by his own mother, apparently weighing heavily on his already burdened shoulders. There were whispers of arguments, of blame being hurled back and forth like poisoned darts in their trendy, now financially strained condo. Their world, built on such shallow foundations, was crumbling. I felt no triumph in their downfall, no malicious glee. Their suffering was of their own making, the inevitable consequence of a lifetime of selfish choices. My only emotion was a kind of weary sadness, a lament for the son I had once known, the potential he had squandered, the love he had so carelessly betrayed. My concern now was for Clara and her children. The bequest I had left her, though modest in the grand scheme of things, would make a tangible difference to their lives. It would ease her financial struggles, perhaps allow her to pursue a long-deferred dream, provide a small cushion of security for Leo and Mia. And that, I knew, was a legacy Robert would have approved of, a legacy rooted in genuine love and a desire to nurture true worth. I had also, in a separate letter, entrusted to Mr. Lowell Bright made a small, discreet provision for my other grandchildren, Daniel and Amelia's children, should they ever, in the future, find themselves in genuine need, and should they ever wish to know the grandmother their parents had so effectively tried to erase. It was a small gesture, a lingering ember of a grandmother's love, offered without expectation, without obligation. My final wishes, meticulously detailed with Miss Albright, were simple: a quiet cremation, my ashes to be scattered in the rose garden at the hospice, alongside Robert's. No fuss, no elaborate funeral, no opportunity for Daniel and Amelia to stage another performance of feigned grief, just a simple, dignified farewell. My story, I suppose, is a cautionary tale. A tale of how easily love can be taken for granted, how quickly respect can erode when faced with relentless entitlement, how even the quietest, most unassuming individuals possess a breaking point. But it is also, I hope, a story of resilience, of quiet strength, of the enduring power of self-respect. They called me a maid, a sensitive old woman, an inconvenience. They tried to diminish me, to silence me, to erase me, but in the end I had the last word. My legacy was not one of bitterness or revenge, but of considered justice, of generosity redirected, of a life, however modest, reclaimed and lived, finally, on my own terms. And as the scent of roses, real or imagined, filled my quiet room, I felt a profound, unshakable peace. The accounts were settled, the house was in order, and the maid, dear reader, had finally, unequivocally, rested her case. The final reverberations of my meticulously planned will continued to echo long after the reading, or so Clara kept me informed from the earthly realm, her letters filled with a mixture of awe and a touch of amused sympathy for my thoroughness. Apparently, Daniel and Amelia did attempt to contest the will, their lawyer, a Mr. Finch, whose reputation for bluster far exceeded his legal acumen, lodging a flimsy appeal based on undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. Ms. Albright, however, had anticipated this. My medical records, including a recent cognitive assessment I'd insisted on, were impeccable. Witness testimonies from Clara, from my doctor, even from a few of my sharper-witted friends at the bridge club who had observed Daniel and Amelia's charm offensive with cynical amusement, all painted a clear picture of a woman in full command of her faculties, making a considered and deliberate decision. The appeal was summarily dismissed. Their last desperate attempt to overturn my final wishes had failed, leaving them not only disinherited, but also, I imagine, with a hefty legal bill from the tenacious Mr. Finch. Clara wrote that the news of their defeat had spread quickly. The sensitive old maid, it turned out, had an estate plan as robust as her resolve. The local hospice and the animal shelter received their bequests without further impediment, both organizations sending heartfelt letters of gratitude to Ms. Albright, expressing how much the funds would help their vital work. That, for me, was the truest vindication, knowing that Robert's memory would be honored, and that creatures who offered only unconditional love would benefit from our shared life savings. Clara, with her own inheritance, was able to finally put a down payment on a small sunny cottage with a little garden, a safe haven for herself and her children, a place where they could build a future free from financial worry. She sent me photographs, Leo and Mia, beaming, planting sunflowers in their new backyard. Their joy was a far more precious legacy than any grand mansion or bulging bank account Daniel and Amelia had coveted. Of Daniel and Amelia themselves, the news was less cheering, though hardly surprising. Their already strained relationship, deprived of the anticipated financial windfall that had perhaps been its primary adhesive, reportedly fractured completely. Amelia, Clara heard, eventually left Daniel, moving back in with her equally grasping parents, her dreams of Aspen ski trips and designer kitchens reduced to bitter recriminations. Daniel, alone, and by all accounts, increasingly isolated, was last heard to be working a low-level office job, the flashy condo long since sold to cover mounting debts. He had, it seemed, finally reaped the bitter harvest of his own weakness and complicity. There was no satisfaction for me in this, only a profound, lingering sadness for the son I had lost, not to death, but to a moral decay of his own making. My own afterlife, if one could call it that, was filled with a quiet, contented peace. I imagined myself in Robert's rose garden, the scent of blossoms heavy in the air, the warmth of the sun on my face. The maid was finally at rest, her duties done, her house in perfect unassailable order. My story, as it was passed down through Clara to her own children, and perhaps one day even to Leo and Mia, would not be one of a victim, but of a quiet victor, a woman who, when faced with disrespect and betrayal, found the strength not just to endure but to act, to reclaim her narrative, to ensure that her final statement was one of dignity, justice, and a love that, in the end, knew its own true worth. And that, I believe, is a sensitivity to be celebrated, a legacy to be cherished.